Last panel before the disruptive dozen, and this really, I think, plays into some of the themes that came out when in that last exchange between Gary and Betsy. We're looking really at the core underlying metabolic problems that really are the mechanistic underpinning of so much of the later heart disease that we see. And no better person to lead this panel than Aura Pescovitz. She has a history as a storied pediatric endocrinologist and investigator, also led a major biomedical enterprise at the University of Michigan. And she's going to, in her current role as Senior Vice President, U.S. Medical Leader of Eli Lilly and Company, host this panel that's entitled The Skinny on Fat, Therapeutic Opportunities. Aura, welcome to the podium and welcome to the rest of the panel.
Well, thank you so much. This has really been a terrific symposium so far, and I have to say that it's a delight to be able to introduce this really exciting panel that we've entitled The Skinny on Fat. I think that everybody is really aware that American waistlines have been expanding and that researchers and policymakers alike are truly struggling today to try to reverse these concurrent epidemics that we have of both obesity and type 2 diabetes that are really besetting our country. And as we think about it, it really is becoming a problem that is overwhelming. Now, obesity has both direct and indirect costs that are becoming truly problematic for our entire nation. Now, we have put together a panel that is truly extraordinary, and it is a combination of both academics and those from industry. And you're going to hear from this truly illustrious panel. The direct medical costs include problems like obesity-related diseases, including heart disease, stroke, type 2 diabetes, high blood pressure, arthritis, related cancers, and others. But there are also indirect costs like those that include problems with quality of life, lost productivity, other illnesses, and the problems to our infrastructure and our economy. So let me set the stage for what we've planned today. We're going to go through 3 major rounds. I'm going to let each of our panelists introduce themselves and tell you what they're primarily working on. That's what we're going to do in the first round. In the second round, I'm going to ask them to tell you what they are most excited about in the field. And then in the third round, I'm going to ask them to tell you what they believe the biggest challenges are. And in the second and the third round, I'm going to ask them to make it interesting and interactive, and I hope they'll have some debate and discussion amongst themselves, and if they don't, I'm going to poke them. And I hope that all of you will start to think of questions that you think will help engage them, because you really do have a group of true experts here today. Now, in order to set the stage for the problem, I'm going to start with Dr. Lee Kaplan and ask him to go first. So Lee, if you could introduce yourself and tell us about your work.
Sure. My name is Lee Kaplan, and I work at Mass General Hospital in the gastroenterology division. And my focus is on the clinical aspects of obesity and diabetes and fatty liver disease. And we spend a lot of the time in our laboratory looking at the mechanisms of bariatric surgery, which has both profound effects on obesity and weight-independent effects on metabolic disease, such as fatty liver disease and diabetes. And so understanding those mechanisms which underlie this profound influence on obesity is sort of critical to what we do. In terms of framing the problem of obesity itself, I would just say a couple of things in addition to what Ora has said. One is that we now know that there are more than 236 by current count, comorbid diseases that have been reported to be associated with obesity. In the area of cardiovascular disease, they fall into three categories. Really, you think about the metabolic disease related to diabetes and atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. But you also have to think about the pressure relationships and what happens when you change pressures, intravascular pressures as well as other body pressures, and that leads to left ventricular hypertrophy, right ventricular hypertrophy from pulmonary hypertension, and heart failure of many sorts. And then the third part is really the other aspect that is affected, which is the intrinsic structure of heart muscle, which is most commonly associated with conduction problems and dysrhythmias. And so you have all those three aspects of cardiovascular disease affected pretty directly by obesity. Last point I would make about obesity is that Ora mentioned that our waistlines are getting larger, but the waistlines of the world are getting larger. And the US is no longer the #1 country in terms of prevalence of obesity. There are at least 6 countries that have a substantially higher rate of obesity, and there are at least 100 countries in the world, there are only 200 countries in the world, but there are 100 countries whose rate of growth of obesity is substantially higher than ours. Everybody's catching up. It's not a disease of lower socioeconomic status. In many parts of the world, it's higher socioeconomic status. It's not a disease of rural America. It's a disease in many other countries of the urban society. And certainly, when you start to parse it out, these cardiovascular complications, these metabolic complications can occur at a far lower body fat mass, particularly in East Asia, Southeast Asia, and South Asia. So when we look at this is the World Medical Innovation Forum, I think we have to look at obesity and its complications as really the 21st century epidemic of the world and no longer just the US.
Thank you, Lee. Dr. Bruce Spiegelman.
Hi, I'm Bruce Spiegelman. I'm professor at the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute in Harvard Medical School. And I am interested in the molecular and biochemical aspects of energy balance and energy metabolism. Such problems as how fat cells develop, how white, brown, and beige fat cells develop. And we're also interested in molecular aspects of exercise, how exercise benefits many of the body's tissues. Obviously, exercise is a first line of defense against obesity, diabetes, and cardiovascular disease, but it brings benefits to the brain and other tissues as well. So Lee and I are sort of the yin and yang. I'm interested in many of the same problems that Lee is interested, but we work more at the molecular level. The organism we typically study is no more than 45 grams, that is a mouse. And we are interested in finding the most fundamental biochemical, molecular, even atomic level regulatory mechanisms that control energy balance. And in the last, say, 15 years, we have especially concentrated on the problems of energy expenditure, specifically thermogenic fat, brown and beige adipose cells, which human beings have. They expend energy to generate heat. They can be major components in the body's whole body energy expenditure. Alongside that, there's also physical activity and exercise. We know that exercise is very good medicine. So the challenge before us scientifically is, how do we understand it? Can we understand it? And can we capture some of the molecules that regulate and participate in some of the health-related benefits of exercise? And I hasten to add, as I feel the need to, that the goal in this is not to replace exercise, but rather to capture those benefits in molecular form so that they can be given to people who cannot exercise, paraplegics, the bedridden, people with Parkinson's disease. And furthermore, can we take the scope and the power of that benefit beyond what can be achieved by exercise? So that's sort of been the mission of my laboratory.
Thank you, Bruce. Dr. Tom Hughes.
Okay, thank you, Laura. So I'm Tom Hughes. I'm CEO at a company called Zafgen. Zafgen is a small publicly traded company here in the Boston area that's focused on a technology that came out of Children's Hospital here in Boston back in the early 2000s that showed that inhibitors of an enzyme in our body called methionine aminopeptidase 2 or METAP2 lead to or drive a really surprising spectrum of improvements in metabolic functions, but also weight loss. And so the company was founded to leverage those observations. Over the past 10 years since the company was founded, we have advanced the technology through clinical trials in some of the toughest to treat forms of obesity, including Prader-Willi syndrome, patients who have had hypothalamic injury, and in more broader populations, including patients who are both obese and have type 2 diabetes. And we've seen that the approach, compounds that inhibit the enzyme, lead to surprising weight loss. At 6 months in patients with diabetes, we had about 13% weight loss from baseline, which is remarkable. We also saw very impressive reductions in HbA1c of about 2% from a baseline in the mid-8 range. And so this, along with improvements in lipid fractions and inflammation, really showed to us that this pathway has a lot of potential. Unfortunately, our lead molecule suffered an imbalance of thrombotic events, and so we've had to retool and come up with new compounds that are free of that effect. We're back in the clinic now and moving ahead. So we're really excited about the possibility of having a molecule that might address multiple comorbid conditions in the same patients who are impacted by obesity, as Lee mentioned, but also by dyslipidemia, by hypertension, by inflammatory burden, as well as in the setting of NASH. And these are things that we know are coexistent in many of the patients who we're really trying to address. In my former life, I was at Novartis for quite a long time and eventually was leading the cardiovascular metabolic drug discovery efforts there. And I was charged with working on each and every one of those issues, so NASH, type 2 diabetes, hypertension, heart failure, but not to address the underlying issue of obesity, which we now see to be really inherently linked to many of these things. So it's good to be able to work on that confluence of effects all in one shot now.
Thank you very much. Ludovic Helfgott.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to be with you on stage today, and good morning, everybody. So I'm Ludovic Helfgott, and I'm the head of the global franchise Cardiovascular, Renal, and Metabolism with AstraZeneca. And I think that this actually summarizes a bit what we're trying to do every day, improving the outcomes of patients suffering with metabolic conditions. And on purpose, I'm using the word metabolic because exactly as you said, and you talked about confluence, I think the discussion has to definitely to be focused on overweight and obesity, but take it from a step back and talking about all the diseases that are actually affecting these very specific populations. Of course, the metabolic disease, type 2 diabetes, NASH, obesity, but also the renal conditions that are very often present in these very specific patients, be there CKD, of course, or even the complications of hyperkalemia or anemia, as well as the third element of the equation, which is the cardiovascular disease. And any point in HbA1c is more or less equivalent to an increase of 20% basis point in cardiovascular relative risk. 1 point, 20% relative risk increase. You should just imagine the weight of that in the overall balance of a patient. And of course, the obese or the overweight patients are in that sense extremely a priority for us because they actually accumulate all these risk factors. So we're going to talk a lot about the brown fat and the beige fat and the white fat, of course, but I would like us also to talk wider about what we're doing to improve the outcomes and the CV outcomes of these patients.
Thank you, Helfgott. Dr. Maury Birnbaum.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here. My name is Maurice Birnbaum. I'm currently the Chief Scientific Officer for the Internal Medicine Research Unit at Pfizer, located here in Cambridge. I joined Pfizer a little over 2.5 years ago after a long career as an academic directing a medical school lab. Pfizer recently formed the Internal Medicine Research Unit, which really combines probably the two
most prevalent causes of suffering in the United States, neurodegenerative disease and cardiometabolic disease, into one unit. I think there are a lot of reasons why it makes sense. There's a lot of reasons why it's a little bit of a stress, but one place where it's very similar is the challenging in developing drugs for an aging population, and that's very common. So the challenges that we've heard about so much today of phase 3 studies in heart disease are very similar to neurodegenerative disease. The other point of having these two together is really to take the fundamental approach that the dysmetabolic state, the modern condition of overnutrition and obesity, really is the major predisposition, not only to cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and those associated conditions, but is also a major predisposing factor for neurodegenerative disease. So while we're taking what at the present I would say is a fairly conventional role of studying these diseases, trying to understand underlying pathologies and developing therapeutics, I think our long-range aspirational goal is to really understand why these diseases are promoted so much by an abnormal metabolic state. So that's where we're heading in the future, I think.
So, we've been talking about how obesity has such enormous costs to society, to individuals, and of course this is a cardiovascular meeting, so obviously to cardiovascular health. And I said that the second round I really wanted to focus on what's most exciting in the field. So I want to understand your thoughts on what's exciting from a pathophysiology perspective, what's exciting from the therapeutic perspective. This could be in the area of new drugs, new devices, new mechanisms of action. So anything that's out there. And I'm interested to know your individual thoughts, and if you disagree with your colleagues, I'd like to hear some disagreement here. So I'd like this to be interactive. You can put on boxing gloves if you'd like to. But I'd like to hear your individual thoughts. So who thinks that they have really the best idea that's out there? So is anybody ready to go with something really hot and new and spill the beans on something really exciting? Bruce, you're ready to?
Somebody's got to go first.
Okay,
so.
you go first. You go first. I want to hear something really
first
cool.
of all, one really important, I think, basic understanding is obesity is a disorder of energy balance, energy intake and energy expenditure. Over the last 100 years, our food supply and the foods we eat have changed a great deal, and energy expenditure and the amount of energy we expend in our daily life has changed. So the first thing I would say is anybody who says that they have the one answer, that it's really food intake or energy expenditure, this or that, you right away be suspicious. So because I take a biochemical approach, and my lab takes a biochemical approach, we tend to be more interested in peripheral, not central mechanisms, meaning we stay away from the brain because it's hard to do biochemistry on brain. I think the energy expenditure aspect of the problem is very interesting. On a human level, we understand, we sit, we work at our computers. Not very many of us work in the fields all day anymore. Between cars, mass transit, and our computers, we expend less and less energy. So I'm interested in the basic processes of energy expenditure. We have in our bodies thermogenic fat. This has been established. Human beings have brown, probably mostly beige fat in adult human beings. And these are fat cells that expend energy, affect lipids in the blood, affect body weight, and certainly affect hepatic steatosis. So we made mice a few years ago that lack beige fat, and the number one phenotype we really see, in addition to a mild obesity, is severe hepatic insulin resistance. So these systems are all interconnected. At the same time, but a lot of other people around the world have recognized that what we don't understand about exercise, that form of energy expenditure, can really teach us a lot and perhaps provide new medicine. So we are very interested in the most molecular pathways that are activated when muscle contracts, when exercise takes place, and how they might benefit the liver and the brain. So for example, you might or might not know that one of the only stimuli that cause de novo neurogenesis in adult human beings is exercise. We don't know how that happens. So I think it's exciting, the prospect to try to mine our understanding of muscle function to how it reaches out to other tissues and to the brain. I'm interested in Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, ALS, and one interesting aspect of studies of those diseases is most of the studies going on come from a particular perspective. Maybe it's beta amyloid deposition or alpha-synuclein deposition. The point is that exercise can teach us something completely orthogonal to that way of thinking. Now, in the end, there may or may not be medicines there, but I think it's an orthogonal approach to the problem, and that's what we need, are orthogonal approaches. So from a biochemical perspective, we are focusing on molecules that affect thermogenic fat and how that happens, and how exercise generates molecules that affect multiple tissues in the body. The heart, of course, is a major target for physical activity, but in addition, we have to also think about brain and cognition and those problems as well. So I think, as I go back to what I started with, anybody who says they have the answer, I think, is kidding themselves and perhaps fooling other people. There are multiple ways in this problem, limited only by our own creativity.
Other thoughts or comments from anybody else in terms of hot?
Yeah. I would just echo what Bruce has just said. I think one of the things that we've learned from our own work is that there's an enormous amount of interconnectedness between different peripheral tissues in the body that work together to orchestrate fat metabolism and glucose metabolism and inflammation as well. And so the sort of canonical, let's say the sort of standard view, if you will, the dogma about control of body weight has always been that the hypothalamus is the control center for this. What we learned is if you could actually remove the hypothalamus from patients and they become obese, they become profoundly obese, drugs like ours can actually still reduce body weight through means that are completely independent of that organ, of course, and that have taught us that the different tissues in the body can actually communicate to different parts of the brain and control energy balance in that way. And so it's much more complicated. And there's an integrated physiological view of control of weight, metabolism, of inflammation that we really are just beginning to tap into. And there's a lot of promise there, I think, a lot of potential.
I really agree with this. Sorry, we won't disagree on this one.
Okay.
I have to fight with them,
Not
but actually
yet.
agree with them, so it's a bit of a problem. No, I agree with that. I think it's actually very complex to imagine that one single bullet will actually solve the problem. And what's exciting right now, from a drug perspective, is actually the combination of three things. First one is, of course, understanding better how fats are evolving. Is white fat that inert? We've heard for a long time that the fat white was inert. It's not. We've seen that in graphs. So really understanding the fats and the signalings is very important, the PPR, for instance. There's something else which is interesting. Of course, the development of new drugs and combination of drugs that are mimicking bariatric surgery. If you put together a GLP-1 and a glucagon, you're going to get results that you would never have with any other compounds alone or even in combination. The third one is that you have new compounds that actually were not designed at all for that purpose, that are eventually proving to be helpful in that very aspect. If you look at the SGLT2s, for instance, and we've talked a lot about them in the more cardiovascular arena over the past couple of days, if you look at the SGLT2s and their impact on cardiovascular mortality, on heart failure, also on weight, you then start to see that there is here some pathways that we haven't explored yet, that honestly, we're still at the very beginning of exploration. So, yes, of course, understanding fat. Yes, of course, developing new compounds that are more traditional in that sector, mimicking bariatric surgery, but also studying compounds that were not meant for that at the very beginning, but actually have an impact on the weight and have an impact on the overall, let's say, CV system, is for me, the solution on top of exercise, as you said rightly, Bruce. There's no single bullet. But it's a super exciting time. And this world that was the CVMD world that was a bit asleep for the past 10 years is now waking up. Well, and it's super vibrant.
I know that none of us is a surgeon here, but I will, you've mentioned several times bariatric surgery, and I myself, in my introduction, was mentioned that I'm a pediatric endocrinologist. And I will just say that, and I want to really maybe address this question to Lee, as I guess the one who maybe sees more patients here today than anybody else on this panel. I wonder what you think about this, because in my own experience, I guess today for the most obese patients, bariatric surgery may be today the most effective form of therapy for the most severely obese patients. So wonder what your thoughts are about that.
So I'm a strong partisan of using bariatric surgery appropriately.
So I'm curious to know what your thoughts are,
But
because
it's
that's
not
my
a-
experience too.
But it's not a public health solution, number one. So let's be straight about that. But it can teach us a lot. And I think, so I'm going to push back on a couple of points that I've heard. You want a little discussion?
Okay.
A couple of points. One is that bariatric surgery, when we started studying it, and we primarily study it in mice, although we also study it in people, that we thought that there would be a series of parallel or interacting mechanisms that were druggable, and then you could basically reproduce bariatric surgery by hitting some combination of those 5 to 20 different pathways. What we've learned over the last decade or so is it doesn't work that way, that a quarter of the genome has its expression at the protein level and at the RNA level affected by bariatric surgery in ways that are very specific to this manipulation, different from drug-induced weight loss, different from lifestyle-induced weight loss. And so what it looks like is that there really is almost a gravitational center to this regulatory system that manipulating the gut does. So whereas before we would have thought, let's look for the downstream effects, let's look at the brown fat, let's look at the hypothalamus, let's look at the hindbrain. Now we say, let's look more at the proximal end to understand bariatric surgery. One point I would make about the complexity, I think we all agree that this is far more complex than we gave it credit for some decades ago. But I would start at the very beginning. Bruce said that it was an issue of energy balance. Actually, people with obesity aren't necessarily in energy imbalance. I have patients who weigh 350 pounds and have weighed exactly 350 pounds for the last decade. They're not in energy imbalance. They are at energy balance at the wrong place. So I think we have to look at two things. One is energy balance, which of course is imbalance is how you get there and how you get out of there. But you also have to look at why does the body defend in those individuals a fat mass that is associated with a weight of 350 pounds. And I think we've focused a lot on what happens when you get to obesity without having focused on what maintains that obesity. And I think that the body wants to regulate fat mass as its energy store. And it has a variety of mechanisms. And I think some of the complexity is rethinking the process in that way. In addition, we know very well that many of the complications of obesity are not dependent upon the act of gaining or losing weight, although some of them are, but they're dependent upon having abnormal amounts of fat, which is associated with abnormal function of fat, which means abnormal inflammatory responses in the fat, abnormal inflammatory responses in the brain, et cetera, et cetera. So when we put that all together, I think we have to sort of think what it is that obesity represents pathophysiologically. Does it really represent an imbalance of energy in and energy out? Or does it represent an abnormal target amount of energy stores, which then leads to pathways? And coming back finally to exercise, it is clear that the power of exercise is remarkable. But I would argue that the main power of exercise is the change in the physiology of muscle cells and their influence, as Bruce said, on fat cells and the liver itself and the brain and elsewhere, rather than the number of calories burned during the process of exercise. I think we have to move away from the idea that we voluntarily control either what comes in or what goes out calorically. What we do control by our behaviors is the physiology of our muscle, our brain, our liver, and all of those things. And then they themselves rejigger the whole process that either leads to obesity or leads away from it.
We have some interesting questions that are coming through, so I'm going to put a couple of them together and ask you what you think about this. People are asking questions around whether we're going to have apps or other devices that might help us down the road to treat obesity. I'm wondering whether any of you think that we might get that coming down the road. Will that be effective for us at some point?
Well, I think, the experience is that behavioral modification has not been tremendously successful in terms of treating obesity. Bruce mentioned earlier, the goal is not to replace exercise. The goal is to supplement it, particularly in those folks who for various reasons can't exercise. The harsh reality is that in the real world, behavioral modification has not worked. I mean, we know that we can treat insulin resistance in dysmetabolic states with exercise. Why does it still exist? Because that is just so challenging. I think, apps will supplement. It'll provide immediate feedback. I'm very skeptical that we're really going to achieve major changes in behavior without some fundamental shift in the way we approach folks. Now, there's no doubt with enormous attention and one-on-one care, we can affect these changes in behavior. But once again, that's too expensive to apply generally. So I think while we would all like to believe that these behavioral changes are the way to go, we have a long history of them not working. So we either need a fundamental shift in approach, nobody's come up with how to do it, or we really have to think in terms of therapeutics to not only aid people in behavioral changes, but actually in many ways, replace those behavioral changes.
Now, all of our panelists have worked in a variety of different ways in either drug development or had challenges in terms of thinking about how to create new things. So what would you say the challenges are now in the field? We've talked about some of the exciting things that are in the future, but what would you say you think some of the challenges are? So Ludovic, I'm going to start this round with you. Give me your thoughts on what you think the challenges are.
I think it's an excellent question. And I see three main hurdles or barriers to that. I think the first one is still science, because I think we haven't yet solved many of these issues, and I think it would be foolish to believe that we understand everything. There are still many things from a mechanistic perspective that we haven't solved yet, and I think it's important to, not to make mistakes, to continue the mechanistic work. Try to understand exactly how the impact we've seen from typical drugs or procedures are actually affecting the metabolism of patients. And the whole change from the central work towards the periphery, which you highlighted earlier on, is one good example of what you do when you realize the side impact or the side effect of your procedures. That's the first one. The second one, of course, I think, and we're going to talk about it because it's a world condition, is the condition of access. And I think it's something that we've talked a lot about. I won't insist too much on it. But definitely the access inequalities in terms of access for these medicines and procedures remains a hurdle to solve this world issue. But there's a third one. There's a third one which I think we are not stressing enough. If you take a step back, again, we need to see how fast will the clinical practices change and evolve with time. Because tomorrow we'll have endocrinologists, we'll have nephrologists, we'll have cardiologists that will see these patients that are coming from different horizons. And they will have to treat them in a holistic manner. And today, it's quite difficult to imagine that. Very much each class of physicians, based on training and their own habits and their own culture, are focusing on one side of the problem, potentially letting aside the others. So when tomorrow you'll have to talk about an anti-diabetic drug to a cardiologist, or an hypokalemic drug to, for instance, a nephrologist, it's going to be a bit of a challenge. And I think for us from the industry, there's definitely a medical education challenge to help physicians from all sorts of categories, including the primary care physicians, to take stock of all the arsenal they have at their disposition and make the right therapeutical choice. And it's not mundane, it's not trivial, and we see it day in, day out. So that for me is a challenge. We didn't thought at first, but from the industry we see it emerging and growing as we speak.
Mm-hmm. And Tom, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, everything that you just said, I agree with completely. I think, first of all, there's been a war on cancer since the Nixon administration. There's never been a war on metabolic diseases, and I think it's something that we should really contemplate given the enormity of the issue. So science really matters. One of the things that I think really needs to be grappled with from a regulatory perspective, though, is this notion of the cardiovascular outcome trial being the sort of key, sort of signature event that one needs to pass in order to have a drug approved. And so for the history of our field, basically, people have been running cardiovascular outcome studies to prove lack of harm being done to the populations. And we've now seen the first compound or compounds showing a benefit in the cardiovascular space. And so this actually changes the bar rather substantially for compounds being developed in there. And I think for the first time, we can now think of emerging therapies as needing to demonstrate benefit to the patients beyond the control of metabolism alone. And this is a challenge, I think, that needs to be really taken on both from a regulatory perspective, but also from a clinical trial design and eventually medical practice perspective. So this is something that I think a lot of us are chewing on today.
Morris?
Yeah, I just want to make a couple of points. First, amplifying on the need for more science and better science. I think the danger there is we let the urgency to develop therapeutics, and it is urgent. There are a lot of people with these diseases. I think there's a real risk that by trying to move quickly, we make bad choices in terms of the science. We can't pick which high-quality science is going to yield important changes in therapies 10 or 20 years from now. I think that's been shown over and over again. I think we look historically at cancer literature. The most profound advances were made in areas that were not directly related to cancer. Yeast genetics, for example, is one Paul Nurse's work. So I think, I think we have to be very careful about trying to move the basic science along so fast that we sacrifice quality and we have the hubris to think we can tell which science is going to lead cures. Now, in terms of drug development, I think there are two clear inflection points that we need help with. The first is we can't bring every good target into people. So we have to have better ways of deciding which targets we are going to develop the small molecules or large molecules for, put through the safety studies, and get into people. That's the first inflection point. And then the second one, particularly for cardiovascular disease, we have to have ways of making the decision which one are we going to bring to the large, expensive trials. Another way of saying that is we need better mechanisms for developing predictors of efficacy in relatively small trials. And without both predictors of translatability and better predictors of success in large outcomes trials, I think we have a very difficult road ahead of us.
Bruce?
Well, it's unfortunately rather easy to talk about challenges. And nobody has mentioned it yet, but the basic science community is in the process of slowly starving. I don't know if we're starving to death, but we're certainly on a starvation diet. So you may realize that the federal budget being on continuing resolution for most of the last 8 years means that the science community has lost, the biomedical community has lost about 20% of its purchasing power. And then the current president suggested a 20% cut on top of that. So it's very difficult now for even good ideas to get funded. It's a struggle, it's a challenge. The second challenge, and Tom and Maury have touched upon this a little bit, is the sense now that in order for industry, biotech, and larger pharma to get interested in trying to develop something from the most basic science level up to advanced preclinical, never mind clinical studies, in the face of what will be cardiovascular outcomes trials. From my perspective, the biopharma industry has becoming very risk averse. They would very much like a guarantee that before investing in a project, they would like a guarantee that there's going to be an outcome, which of course is impossible. the way people dealt with this in previous decades was for academics who thought they had a promising idea to raise money and to try to develop it in the small biotech. And I think there's still a lot of innovation in small biotech, but the runways are very, very short. And the bar is very high, and let's call a spade, particularly in cardiovascular related things. The bar is very high to move something along to clinical development. So right now, the rage in biopharma is cancer and orphan diseases, someplace where the bar is lower and one doesn't have to deal with monstrously large phase 3, phase 4 clinical trials. So it's a tough time right now if you're on the basic science side hoping to move things forward into the clinic, and that my lab does have that dream. It's very challenging both to get the basic science funded and to get traction in the biopharma community.
Lee?
Yeah, so I agree with everything that everybody has said, and particularly the science piece of it. But I want to I think the problem in obesity is the same as everything else, but also accelerated or accentuated compared to everything else. And it's at a much more basic level. The question always is, if you're developing new therapies, do you develop the therapy against the underlying obesity, or do you develop the therapy against one of the complications, one of those 200 plus complications? And it's easy to develop against the complications relatively, with all of the easier relatively, but with all those challenges that Maury described, that Bruce described, they're even greater in obesity. And I think there are two reasons for that, and those are the two sort of barriers that I would want to emphasize. One is that we not only don't understand the science of obesity well enough, but it's complex enough that there are very, very likely multiple, if not multiple dozen, if not multiple hundreds subtypes. And the notion, obesity almost gets in its own way because we think of it as a monolithic disorder, and then we want to have a solution for everybody with the disorder. But we know that with the regulatory systems being so heterogeneous, for example, why do some people who weigh 500 pounds not only not have diabetes, but they don't have any insulin resistance? And why do some people who have a BMI of 22 have full-blown diabetes and cardiovascular complications? That's just one example, but that's just one axis. The second major problem is because we don't appreciate, or the public doesn't appreciate the science and the complexity, they assume that 100% of obesity is voluntary. And that comes back to the issue, the question that was raised about apps. Apps regulate your voluntary action, but the final common pathway of obesity per obesity, is pathophysiology. It may be that you don't exercise and therefore you have sick muscle, and your sick muscle doesn't signal adequately to the brain or the liver or the brown fat, but the final common pathway is pathophysiological. And because of that misunderstanding, there's an enormous amount of cynicism and skepticism and prejudice about studying obesity, treating obesity, and having obesity. And that prejudice and that stigma is almost built into the soil that determines whether obesity is going to have a war against it or metabolic disease, whether there's going to be enough research for basic science in this field. Interesting factoid, and I'll end with that, is that over the past 30 years, the average spend per patient for HIV/AIDS is $3,000 per year for research per patient per year by the NIH. And for obesity, it's between $5 and $7. And even when you take into account that HIV/AIDS is far less common, you still see that the global spend is only 20% as much for obesity as it is for HIV/AIDS. Now, we've made enormous progress in HIV/AIDS between 1980 and now. We could have made a similar amount of progress if we had put that kind of resource into it. So I think that the underlying stigma, the underlying misunderstanding of the biology of the disease, and finally the heterogeneity of the disease, meaning that you're going to have multiple different targets and you're not going to be able to have one size fits all. All of those, to me, underlie all of the other barriers that have been described.
We only have a few moments remaining, and I want to be cognizant of some of the very interesting questions that have been asked. So I'll throw out a few together and let you pick and choose which ones you choose to address. So there was a very interesting question here about whether or not the microbiome is an important system that is relevant to the study of obesity, so I'll let you think about whether you want to address that. I know that we talked earlier about whether NASH is something that we should be thinking about. We didn't address that here in this panel. And then there was an interesting question about whether we shouldn't be more focused on food science, and if we spent more energy thinking about how to address our food supply and food science, would we not be more successful? So I'm going to ask each of you to pick one of those topics. You can pick any one. We're going to have one last round. If you see the clock, we only have a few minutes remaining. So each of you can pick one of those topics. We're going to go a lightning round. Pick one, and you can answer any one of those three. I'll start here with Maureen.
So I'll start with NASH. And that's
Okay.
non-alcoholic steatohepatitis for those of you who have been in a cave the last 5 or 10 years. There's an enormous amount of interest in it. It is, as most of you know, there's a progression starting with fatty liver, which is a virtual inevitability if you have obesity and insulin resistance, fatty liver, inflamed fatty liver, fibrotic, and then ultimately cirrhotic, and with a small percentage progressing from the initial stage. Enormous amount of interest in the community. Most people with fatty liver die of heart disease, or most people with NASH die of heart disease. What is still an open question is whether treating that NASH will actually have a profound effect on the development of cardiovascular disease. Arguments on both sides. I think it's an incredibly interesting area. Drug companies, including Pfizer, are all over it. I think one of the risks we're going to have socially is not have people think of this as an example where the drug companies are inventing a disease so they can sell more drugs. I think it is a real disease.
Okay.
Agree
Ludovic.
with that. Again, on NASH, definitely an area where we want to focus on. Two challenges. The first one is the one you just described, which is not inventing a disease. It's a real problem, and we absolutely need to address it. The other one is from a research perspective. It's not always easy to actually run research on NASH because, of course, you need biopsies. And then, of course, as you can imagine, it's a very complicated area to get in. So we have to find on NASH, the challenge is not just the disease definition, it's to find the right way to make sure that whatever we do in NASH has an impact on the patient, because you can't always measure what you're doing. So definitely to get focus there. Challenge in the way you conduct research as well.
Okay. Tom?
So I'm probably the only one here with a PhD in nutrition, so I'll take food science.
Okay.
Food science for 100. I think the simplest answer is, I think coming back to Lee's point, there's a lot of bias in this area. I think if we think that we can fix the obesity problem or the metabolic disease problem by adjusting the food supply, I think we're missing the point. There's lots of good that can come from doing that, but I think the data that support that it would have any impact whatsoever is really very thin. And so there's a need for better studies, I think, if we're going to go down that path.
Lee?
So nobody's taken on microbiota. So let me take on microbiota since we study microbiota. The only thing I'm going to say about it is that there is abundant evidence that the microbiota influences metabolic and inflammatory biology throughout the body. But in studies that we've done and other groups have done, the effect size is small. Mm-hmm. And so people want to imagine because it's yogurt that it's going to solve all the world's problems. But the basic science says it might solve 5% of the world's problems. Mm-hmm. And that's a huge difference. And I think that people misunderstand thinking that the master regulator is in some way the microbiota that then puts into motion all of these other pathways. It's not true. It's probably parallel pathways, interacting pathways. I'd like people to consider that the microbiota is an organ that happens to be made up of viruses and prokaryotic cells and prokaryotic viruses, bacteriophage, that together resides in the lumen of the gut and elsewhere, but I'm going to talk about the gut. That's an organ in the gut that communicates with the rest of the body. Well, if we discovered the liver yesterday, we wouldn't be able to say the liver is the seat of the soul and every other aspect of the body. Neither is the microbiota. So The second thing I have to say about microbiota, because it's so critical, because everybody talks about it, and there are so many companies out there, maybe represented in this room, that focus on that, is that probiotics and compositions of bacteria are going to have to be redefined based on what we're learning about the microbiota. And the idea that if you go and eat a particular yogurt, you are going to be doing God's work and fixing obesity and metabolic and cardiovascular disease may be true, but that yogurt hasn't been defined yet. So we have to think about the future yogurts, but not confuse them with the present
This
yogurt.
would be a very good yogurt then.
Okay. Bruce, take your pick.
Okay, well, I'm going to carry on with what Lee said. I am agnostic on the therapeutic potential of manipulation of the microbiota, but I'll broaden it out a little bit to multiple things we're talking about: exercise, brown fat, bariatric surgery. However, by studying these things in detail, in molecular detail, we might find the enzyme, the molecule, where in its natural context provides a modest benefit, but that's not to say that if we understand it better, we may not be able to use it to bring about a major benefit. So I'm agnostic, meaning I think research is good in this area. There are some effects. They don't have to be big enough per se to mean we should study it and understand where that benefit is coming from. So that's the case I would make.
Great. Okay, well, please join me in thanking our wonderful panelists.